Okay, good morning. Today is Tuesday, February 9th. It's 10 a.m. and this is a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We are visiting this morning, starting off first thing with Secretary Moore to catch up on the Global Warming Solutions Act, which we think we've been following at a bit of a distance, but we haven't heard from the Secretary on how that's going. So it's a chance for us to have a conversation about what's going on there. And with that, I'd like to welcome Secretary Moore back to the committee and turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Bray. I'd like to start this morning by introducing Jane Lazorch. Jane has recently been hired on as the Global Warming Solutions Act Project Director. This is one of the 3 positions the legislature provided to the agency as part of the initial budget allocation for the Global Warming Solutions Act. Jane's first day was yesterday, although she may be a familiar face to you in that she has worked for the Fish and Wildlife Department for more than 15 years prior to making the jump over to serve in this new capacity. And would just love to give her a minute to introduce herself to all of you.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me jump in at the last second. I appreciate the Secretary's introduction, and I'm really excited to take on this really ambitious challenge over the next less than a year to develop the climate action plan. And I feel like I'm catching on to a moving train because over the last few months, the Climate Council has now met a handful of times. We're working full bore to get the subcommittees up and going, the work developed to meet the ambitious goals of the climate action plan. And coming from an background of dealing with land and land management, I'm just really excited about the new challenge in front of me and the work to get to know all of you and others involved in this initiative. So I'm excited. I'm happy to take any questions around the role and look forward to the Secretary's explanation of where we are at right now with the process. So thank you for letting me join this morning.
Great. Well, welcome to Senate Natural Resources and Energy, and glad to have you aboard. Could you just say a little bit about what your job is on that? Sure. As part of the team?
Yeah, so there's the Climate Council, obviously, which is staffed by both cabinet members and House and Senate appointments. There'll be subcommittees staffing those. And then my role with respect to supporting the Secretary as the project director will be to sort of keep a pulse on all of the different work and aspects of the committees, the council, as well as our agency staff and other agency staff that will be supporting those councils, the council and committees. We'll be moving forward with support through facilitation contracts, communications contracts, technical contracts. My job will sort of be keeping all of those balls in the air while working towards the ambitious deadline of this fall to actually have a climate action plan in place to present to the legislature next session. So for this first 9 months or so, the real eye on the prize is the development of the plan and working with all the various pieces and people involved to coordinate that effort. And then moving forward, it'll be stepping into more of an implementation role and helping the state advance the strategies and goals put forward in that plan in the coming years. So I'm excited, as I said, to figure that all out in the coming months.
All right, well, great. The fact that you're excited tells me you're someone who likes to have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I'm learning that. We went through the to-do list yesterday, and as I said, the train is moving fast. The deadlines are ambitious, so it's exciting.
Okay, well, thank you. If you don't have anything else, we could go back to the Secretary. And before sort of a general update, I realized there was a little bit of a cloud hanging over the GWSA as it got started. And I'd like to just check in briefly. I don't want to make this into a big deal, but I just want to know what the status is. There was a question around constitutionality and a possible suit, but the council has moved on and is doing its work. I don't know if that has been resolved and sort of put it behind us, or it's still a pending question in some quarters.
I think it's fair to say it's still a pending question. I want to be clear that the question is really about the composition of the council and the constitutionality of that, not the scope of work. And so in many ways, the work that Jane's leading needs to proceed regardless. There's no question about what the content of the climate action plan ultimately needs to entail. And frankly, the legislation is equally clear that if for some reason the council does not act, those same obligations flow to the Agency of Natural Resources. So we have every reason to proceed apace, but would flag for the committee that the concern about the constitutionality of the composition of the council remains. It is my understanding that the administration does not intend to take that up, but just was flagging that overall as a concern moving forward.
Okay, and not to use too much of our time on it, can you just remind committee members in a nutshell what it is about the composition of the council that was the nut of the concern?
I can do my level best. Would say that Jay Johnson, the governor's counsel, is probably the one who's best able to articulate those concerns, in part because we'll reflect that I'm not a lawyer, but that the composition of the council is such that there are 8 ex officio members and 15 legislative appointees. The council itself then is not acting as advisory to the governor, but rather adopts the climate action plan, and without having a document that returns to the legislature for review or approval, it is the intent of the legislation, based on my reading, that the administrative agencies would move directly into implementation, including making regulatory changes and proposing new legislation. And so there's concern about both the structure of the council in terms of the weight of the various memberships, and then that the legislature does not have a clear role in reviewing the climate action plan before it moves directly to implementation.
Okay, so it'd be membership, and then that we have perhaps, in some people's legal opinion, delegated our authority. Okay.
Yes, I would say
Senator
that's
McDonald.
Just since it was brought up that we're not wishing to take up too much time on this, from the bombing in Pearl Harbor to the surrender of Japan in World War II was less than 4 years. So let's not take too much time. Welcome aboard.
Thank you, Senator.
All right, so thank you for that clarification on that, the legal bit, but as you pointed out, there's a lot of work to do. So let's turn to hearing more about what the council's been up to, and go back to that piece.
Sure. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's all right. And this is a PowerPoint presentation that I did, or that my assistant Penny did send to the committee, I believe this morning. So hopefully you can all see this. Somebody give me a thumbs up if you can.
Yes, we can.
Great. But you should also have copies available. So my hope is to give you both an update on our progress, as well as just walk you through the budget adjustment request that my understanding is likely part of the BAA headed to the Senate floor, possibly as soon as today. Let's see. Oh, here we go. So I thought I would start just by reviewing sort of the requirements of what needs to ultimately be contained in the climate action plan. While it does focus on the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and achieve several different targets that are established for 2025, 2030, and 2050, there are other components that we are asked to address in the climate action plan, including developing specific initiatives, programs, and strategies for encouraging smart growth, looking at carbon sequestration, adaptation, achieving net zero emissions by 2050, seeking to reduce energy burdens, and with particular attention paid to rural and marginalized communities, making sure that we are also looking at the use of chemicals or substances that can contribute to climate change, and this overall focus on adaptation and resilience, and the importance of our natural and working lands to achieving those goals. In addition to the specific initiatives, strategies, and programs that we identify in the plan, they need to be developed with an eye on 7 objectives. First and foremost, that we're prioritizing the most cost-effective and technologically feasible work, that we are spreading this work across all of the sectors that contribute to our emissions profile. And I'm sure for this committee, it could go without saying that our two largest sectors are transportation and greenhouse gas emissions associated with building, heating, and cooling. We need to make sure we're minimizing any negative impact to spread them equally across different economic sectors, making sure we're looking at industries, technology, and training that will allow workers in Vermont to benefit from this transition away from fossil fuels. There is a continued emphasis placed on natural solutions, including our working lands, so both forests and agriculture, and then encouragement to continue our participation in interstate and regional initiatives designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, probably most notably among them RGGI, but also the TCI, the Transportation and Climate Initiative. So the Global Warming Solutions Act established a series of dates and milestones. The act was put into place September 23rd, and the General Assembly had 60 days from that date of enactment to make appointments. We received all of our appointment notices on October 23rd, and were given 30 days by statute to convene the first meeting of the council. The first meeting of the council was held on November 20th. We did deliver our first annual progress report to the General Assembly, which is a high-level overview of the content of all of the meetings back on January 15th. And we are charging forward towards having a draft climate action plan available for public comment by October 1st of this year. And then ultimately the council adopting the climate action plan by December 1st. As Jane had indicated in her comments, the council has met several times since November 20th. Most recently having met yesterday to look at subcommittee membership, but I've provided just a high-level sense of what we took on in each of the meetings. We are anticipating that the council will meet at least monthly. We have a standing meeting the fourth Monday of the month scheduled through the end of December, but anticipate we may have to meet more frequently in order to accomplish the council's work. The two most recent meetings probably were the most substantive. The first 3 or 4 meetings were far more foundational. As you might expect with a council of 23 members, there's a diversity of backgrounds and depth of existing knowledge when it comes to climate action work. And so we're trying to build a common foundation for all members to work from. But on January 25th, we did have the opportunity to hear from speakers from Massachusetts, Maine, and New York about the related efforts going on in each of their states, as well as discussing our process design for moving forward. And we formed a steering committee. Then the council again met yesterday to look at subcommittee membership. And I have a few more slides on each of those items just to get into a bit more detail. So the council steering committee is comprised of 6 members, myself and Secretary Young on behalf of the executive branch, as well as 4 members selected from the legislature's appointments. And the idea here will be that the steering committee will develop the agenda for council meetings, help set a framework for the subcommittee work. We are also in the process of contracting for both technical facilitation and education and outreach support services. And the steering committee will have a role in sort of vetting the utilization of those different services, and then ultimately tracking progress of all the subcommittees over time to ensure we remain on track with the statutory deadline. The subcommittees themselves, there were 4 established in statute, as well as in a provision that allows any other subcommittee that the council identifies as important to its work to be established. And the council has agreed to establish a 5th subcommittee, a science and data subcommittee. We are anticipating subcommittees will meet weekly from March until June. So this is a fairly significant undertaking for all involved. And we currently have out on the street a broad solicitation for interest in subcommittee membership that closes this Friday. that is posted on the Agency of Administration's website, where they have a climate council page. Subcommittees are going to each have at least 2 chairs, one from the executive branch and then one from the legislatively appointed members. And in some cases, we are considering a third. The attributes of those co-chairs is that they need to have sufficient time available to do the work. They need to have some substantive expertise in the area, and then this willingness to work collaboratively. And there will be a process we're going to engage in over the next week or two to select non-council members to fill gaps within the ranks of the subcommittees. Each subcommittee will then make a recommendation of a proposed slate of members back to the council, and the council will confirm the slate. Just so you can see where we're starting from, these are the way council members as well as administration co-chairs have been assigned to each of the committees thus far. We are trying to keep subcommittee membership in the range of 8 to 10. So in general, we're seeking 3 to 5 additional members for each one of these subcommittees. We do anticipate that the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee may be somewhat larger because it will need to take up sort of each of the key sectors for greenhouse gas emissions, and so requires perhaps a broader diversity of expertise than some of the other subcommittees. In terms of how we are approaching the work overall, the first task is to inventory existing programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as existing programs to build resilience. Then move to identifying and analyzing and evaluating new strategies or programs that may be necessary to achieve our goals, including thinking about cost effectiveness. As we build the programs, starting from the get-go, thinking about the monitoring strategy we're going to use to assess our progress. Ultimately, we'll have to culminate in identifying rules to be adopted by ANR, legislative changes that would need to come back to the General Assembly as we move to adopt the Climate Action Plan by December 1st. And then the plan needs to be updated every 4 years thereafter.
Would we go back, please, one slide?
Mhm.
Sorry. Sorry, it was this one, the sequence of work. So developing financing strategies. Is that a working group, or who's going to be taking on that? The whole council as a group?
So one of the 3 contracts that we are working to secure at this point is a technical services contract. And there's actually sort of 3 buckets of work that fall under the umbrella of technical services. One is emissions modeling, one is economic modeling, and then one is the monitoring and assessment. And so we are envisioning that the charge to the cross-sector mitigation committee is to identify the most cost-effective strategies, and that it will be that committee working in concert with a technical consultant that can do the economic modeling to actually evaluate both cost effectiveness and potential approaches to pay for.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And then the last piece I had in here was just another way of looking at the timeline. I think it probably cannot be said enough how aggressive this timeline is. Unlike Maine's climate action plan, which you may be familiar with as it was delivered to the governor there earlier this year, ours needs to get not only to the what of climate action, but the how, the specific programs, initiatives, and strategies. What this means is we really need subcommittees to complete their work and make their recommendations to us by the end of June. It will allow some amount of time for stakeholder and public engagement as the council then works to refine recommendations and assemble this draft climate action plan. We anticipate another round of stakeholder and public engagement once the plan is assembled and sort of stands together as a document before the council finalizes and adopts the action plan by December 1st.
Okay, great.
And then just a little bit about the funding pieces. So as you may recall, there was $450,000 in base funding for the Global Warming Solutions Act that was included in ANR's 21 budget. As I indicated, there are 3 types of contracted services that are needed: the technical services, facilitation services, and then communications and outreach work. We've used the $450,000 in the FY21 budget as follows. We are in the process of hiring 3 FTEs. Jane is first among them, but we will also be hiring a program technician to help support this work, as well as ultimately a legal resource, which will become more and more important as we move into the rulemaking phase of the implementation. The statute provides per diem for climate council members. As part of budget adjustment, it's my understanding that it's been proposed to extend the ability to pay per diems not only to members of the Climate Council, but also seated members of the subcommittees. So this number reflects our best estimate for the council, but we believe within our budget adjustment request, there's capacity to accommodate per diems for subcommittee members as well. And at this point, that would leave us with about $200,000 available for contracted services. As part of the 21 budget adjustment, we did request an additional $1 million support for implementation, and that money sugars off this way. 850,000 of it for technical support services. And as I noted, Senator Bray, it's in those 3 large buckets. We issued a request for information back in early January and received 15 responses to that request that Jane is now working her way through. We anticipate we will be issuing 1 or more RFPs. It's sort of unclear. It was unclear to us out of the gate if there is one contractor that would be capable of doing all 3 components of this work, or if we might be better served by issuing separate RFPs. And so we are in the process of evaluating that. We have done a sole source contract with an organization called the Consensus Building Institute to support the meetings of the council in January and February, and have an RFP out right now with responses due back on Friday for ongoing facilitation and process support services for the length of the council's efforts to develop the climate action plan, providing direct support to the council and support services to the subcommittees. And then we have budgeted about $190,000 for public engagement and outreach. And as I indicated, we're anticipating that will occur at 2 key points in time, as well as the need to stand up a more robust web presence to allow Vermonters to engage with us on their own time and schedule. Just a little bit more detail on exactly how that money breaks down, so you can get a sense for exactly what's going where and what our timeline looks like. But then ultimately, that we believe that the ongoing annual appropriation of the $450,000 should be sufficient to cover staffing and operating needs once we've completed the plan, but that this extra infusion of resources is really essential to our ability to deliver a draft climate action plan by December 1st. It was a bit challenging, just given the aggressive nature of our schedule, to try to deign where we would be on June 30th. And so we have requested all of the funding for the contractual services as part of the Budget Adjustment Act, rather than including any portion of it in our FY22 budget. And that would be the end of the slides I had prepared, but happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great. Well, thank you for filling us in. That it was just right.
Yeah.
I covered a lot of territory, plus a fair amount of detail at the same time. I have a quick question in terms of, so that we don't have to, ask you to sort of do this repeatedly. Do you have something along the lines of a Gantt chart that we can get regular updates on, so that
Hey, Shadi, I'm in the meeting, but not on camera. Excuse me. Can you folks hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
well, not, we won't in a moment. There we go.
Yes,
Okay.
we are in the process of putting together a Gantt chart. hope to have something available to share with frankly, with the council at our meeting on the 22nd. And then I'm happy to provide that to this committee or the General Assembly as well.
Okay, great. That way we could, and if we have questions, we could ask you to come back in or something like that, but at least we could stay in the loop. I know there's a concern about how independent the council may or may not be from the legislature. And I think, for my own personal take is that as this legislator is looking at the work going on there as a resource for us to continue to learn from and draw on, not that we're sort of passively waiting for them to proceed and then we're going to say, well, I wonder what will happen next. I think we'll be actively engaged in using the work product that you're all putting together. So any committee questions for the secretary or Ms. Lazorchak?
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming in this morning. Good to meet you, Ms. Lazorchak. Good luck. And we are going to switch gears this morning, and another topic of interest to the secretary, but I think you have to leave, right? Is we're going to be talking about PCBs and monitoring toxic levels, state versus federal levels, and toxics in general. And we're going to be joined by members of the Senate Health and Welfare Committee, since it's of interest to both committees. So thank you again, Madam Secretary. I'm guessing you have places to go, and so don't feel rude, just checking out.
All right, always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, too.
All right, so welcome Senator Lyons, Senator Hooker. We'll wait for you to tell us that you've got everyone on your committee here, or at least a quorum. And so as you all know, good morning, Senator Lyons. Thanks for coming over. It's always good to be able to do work that both committees are interested in together, so we're not asking agency folks, especially folks at Department of Health who are so busy right now, to present the same information twice in two different committees. So, and then Senator Campion chairs education. So there's a lot of cross interest here. And Senator Hooker, you're vice chair of education.
There's
right?
practically the whole education committee here, nearly.
Right.
We've got a quorum.
Four members will be. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just like a trifecta.
We've got a couple more folks, three more people from Health and Welfare who should be here pretty soon. So
Okay.
as soon as we have one more, we'll have a quorum.
Okay.
Here we go. Nope. Not yet. Senator Westman and Senator McCormick, we do miss you, but we've got some great people. I hope you guys are enjoying yourselves in natural resources.
We are.
You're where the action is, though, with this COVID stuff.
Unfortunately, that is the case, but I think it's everywhere. It's not one place, it's everywhere. So Senator
Okay, so I
Bray,
see.
we have a quorum.
Great. I see Senator Hardy just came in. Okay, great. So especially, again, acknowledging that Department of Health is under a lot of pressure these days to do a lot of work. We want to get started promptly. So the reason for today's invitation was driven first and foremost by the discovery of PCBs at Burlington High School at such a level that they've had to move out and find alternate headquarters, whatever, for the foreseeable future. So we wanted to check in and learn more about not just the Burlington High School question, but also how what the levels are, how you judge the toxicity of PCBs, and how a state standard functions compared to a federal standard, Usually people are saying, well, they appreciate that Vermont's standard being more I think in some cases more strict. I'm thinking of PFAS, for instance, that we're more protective than the federal standards of the health of Vermonters, and that's a good thing. Someone did come back to me going the opposite direction and say, well, if we increase the Vermont's levels to match the federal levels, would Burlington High School then be judged safe? And that would be the direction we would go. So I'm not sure we're not here to make any choices or recommendations this morning, but just to know why there's a difference and if what the state's thinking is why we have a difference and where we might go next. So I see Ms. Vose, Mr. Englander, Ms. Capolino. I don't know if we should call on you in order on our agenda. That would be Ms. Vose first, or if someone, you're all three here. We're asking you to, this could be like tag team wrestling. You can move back and forth between yourselves in order to work on the questions at hand. So why don't we start with just an explanation of PCBs as a toxin briefly, and what and why there's two standards in play and how that relates to the Burlington High School scene. And then just to add a little more, and how is Burlington High School representative of high schools or other public buildings generally from that era? Some people worry that BHS might be kind of the canary in the mine shaft, telling us about other schools of that vintage.
Yeah, this is Sarah, and if it's okay with everyone, we would like Trish to go first because she's got a PowerPoint that'll give you some of that information, and then I'm happy to answer questions and discuss more after that.
Great, thanks so much.
So just give me a minute to get the PowerPoint up. I'm Trish, by the way.
Good morning, thanks for coming in.
Sure. Are you seeing that?
Not yet.
No. Okay, hold on 1 second. Sorry.
So Senator Bray, maybe
Yes,
Jude
ma'am.
could put it up. You think Jude could put that up for her?
Give me
'Cause we
1
don't
second. I'm trying one more time. All right, this should work.
Ah, there it is.
There we are.
Okay. So I wanted to go over just a little of, what PCBs are. So polychlorinated biphenyls. They are human-made chemicals. They were used commonly in buildings and electrical equipment. EPA banned them in 1979. PCBs are harmful to the immune system, reproductive, nervous, and endocrine systems. They, can cause impaired immunologic development, fertility problems, changes to brain development in utero, thyroid hormone changes, increases in type 2 diabetes, and they are cancer causing. So they're not good chemicals for the environment or people. And Sarah, Dr. Vose can go over a lot more of how these played into the values we're looking at. Specific to PCBs and building materials, because that's what we're talking about. They were used to impart flexibility, basically, to keep products soft so they wouldn't get hard and dry up. Where we find them mostly in buildings and specifically in schools, in the caulking, in the paint, fluorescent light ballasts, and the capacitors that are in those light ballasts, window glazing, ceiling tiles, spray on fireproofing, floor finish, and mastics, such as the glue or resin. So there isn't, I would say, one thing that PCBs are not found in, for the most part, in older buildings. Why is this a concern? So why do these PCBs in building materials impact us. So our biggest concern with schools is the impact to indoor air. They can be released into the air through off-gassing. So if you have caulking that has PCBs in it and it's in the building, PCBs can off-gas like a vapor into the air for it to be inhaled and breathed. PCBs can be absorbed into the building materials that are surrounding. I'm going to use caulk a lot that are next to the caulking. So the masonry next to the caulking can become impregnated with PCBs, and now the building material itself is now contaminated with PCBs. Furnishings inside the buildings have this great foam inside them that absorb PCBs, and they can become a long-term sink and continue to off-gas and provide PCBs to the air. And then dust itself can settle onto the contaminated building material, become contaminated, and then become airborne and spread throughout a building. And then going on to the last bullet is that some of the PCBs present in some of the products can contaminate the adjoining materials and contaminate them. They can fall out of the building and contaminate the ground surface outside the building also. The health department and Agency of Natural Resources and the Agency of Education worked on a potential process that we think would work when looking at the potential for PCBs in schools. Our thought process was looking at any school that was constructed or renovated before 1980, and renovated because you could have used any of the PCB containing products to renovate, such as the caulking or the paint or the mastic. If a school was not constructed or renovated before 1980, we didn't think testing was necessary. We also wanted to make sure that all of the old fluorescent light ballasts and capacitors were replaced. I understand that Vermont went through a pretty large process of getting all of these out of schools, so that's already, good for us. But sometimes some of the capacitors may have leaked, so we want to see if there's any oil leaking or the capacitor itself was not removed when the light ballast was removed. And then we would look to see what sources of PCBs could exist in the school. We came up with a checklist that identifies most of the products that I listed earlier and others that could be in the school, to use that in determining where potential sources of PCBs could be in the school. And then the next step would be testing the indoor air for PCBs. And we put together a guidance document that goes through what the testing looks like, the analytical methods and reporting requirements. When results come back in, determining where potential sources of PCBs could be. When the results come back in, we'd work with the Department of Health to evaluate what the concentrations were and any next steps that were needed. And then we would work with the schools to determine where the sources might be and how to best remove or mitigate those exposures. The question is, what does that look like if you do detect PCBs in indoor air? What do you do next? So we'd go back to making sure that all of the fluorescent light ballasts were removed, that there wasn't any staining inside the building. If school's in session, we'd look at trying to implement some best management practices. So ventilation, wet cleaning to clean surfaces and ductwork to make sure we're getting any contaminated dust out of the school. Collaboration with health, working on how to address any detected concentrations, the risk, and the next steps. Sampling to identify PCB sources in the school. Looking at how to remove any of those sources, and then mitigate if you can't remove them. And then resampling to ensure that we've done the best that we can. These are the current screening values that exist. For the most part, just to take a step back, PCBs are regulated by EPA. Most PCBs, actually all PCBs in building materials are regulated by EPA, and the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, for the most part, regulates PCBs in soil, groundwater, surface water sediments, not in building materials. This is a way for us to ensure that PCBs that are in building materials and impacting indoor air are being taken care of, and we're being protective of the people that work in the schools, students and teachers. So the Department of Health calculated a screening value that's 15 nanograms per cubic meter that we look at as the detection that if you're below that, you don't need to do additional work, and if you're above it, we need to evaluate further. EPA has several different values that they have to evaluate impacts to indoor air in schools, and they're listed below in this table, and they're based on age of the school population. I want to be clear, though, that EPA is basically saying that these are not to be interpreted as bright line or not to exceed values, and that EPA is recommending that concentrations of PCBs in indoor air be kept as low as reasonably achievable. So even if you achieve one of those values, it doesn't mean that your school is okay. You still have additional work to do under EPA authority. In 2013, the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Health, and Agency of Education, I think at that time it might have been the Department of Education, we were working towards trying to evaluate potential PCB impacts to our schools in Vermont. And so we looked at 4 different schools in the state that met the criteria I listed before, built or renovated before 1980. So we did Berrytown, Champlain Elementary, Holland Elementary, and Mount Anthony. And so for Berrytown, the takeaway here was that we collected 23 indoor air samples in the school. 3 of the samples had detections. They're listed there, 3356 and 130 nanograms per cubic meter. After evaluation by the Department of Health, it's determined that the levels are not a significant health threat because the average indoor air concentrations were below 15 nanograms per cubic meter, and we didn't require any additional work. Champlain Elementary is in the same situation. We collected 20 indoor air samples there. 4 of those had detections. They're listed out, 27, 32, 36, and 65, and it was the same analysis and outcome for Champlain Elementary. The other 2 schools were Holland and Mount Anthony. Holland had 10 samples, Mount Anthony had 24. They all came back non-detect, less than 15 nanograms per cubic meter. So we were feeling okay, I guess, about our outcome with the schools. But here's Burlington High School and what we're finding in Bronson High School. So I only listed 4 of the buildings. We did sample 6 of the buildings that were there. And I'm listing them out as buildings because they are separate buildings that are just connected by walkways. So building A, we've done up to 12 indoor air samples. Concentrations ranged from 4, so it's still below the 15, to up to 260 nanograms per cubic meter. Building B, 12 samples range from 27 to 270, so all 12 were contaminated. Building D, same thing, 10 indoor air samples, and they range between 11 and 300 nanograms per cubic meter. And building F ranged from, I actually can't see, this is 160, I think, 160 to 7,100 nanograms per cubic meter. Building F was the building that we got the results back first, which caused the school to consider relocating the students. So for each building, what we're doing with Burlington High School, it sounds like you wanted to have a little background on the work that we're doing there. The school's consultant has gone through and they've done a very comprehensive survey of all the potential PCB containing products within the school. They are collecting a lot of data so that we can understand what products might be causing the largest impacts to the indoor air so that they can be removed as part of the renovation or mitigated if they can't be removed. We are starting to get results back from building A, and based on what my understanding is right now, that the caulking and the floor mastic have some of the higher concentrations in building A. They are working methodically through each building to try and collect building material samples so they can have a better understanding of how to best renovate, remediate, and mitigate the school for future use. The budget considerations that went into the requests or went into the governor's budget that you're looking at was based on our estimate of the fact that there might be up to 300 schools statewide that meet the basically built or renovated before 1980. We're looking at, a range of costs to sample each school, which would be between $15,000 and $20,000 per school to collect indoor air samples. And the remaining funds would be used to provide a publicly accessible data management system and provide technical assistance from both Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Health. What was not considered in the budget is if indoor air concentrations are found to be elevated, there is no cost within that budget to do any of the sampling I was just talking about that's happening at the Burlington High School to look for those sources within the school. There's no cost in the budget to remediate or mitigate an impacted school. And the costs that I've listed here are ranging between small school where you're just taking out some caulking to large complex schools where there are a lot of different building material contaminant issues. None of these costs include replacement costs. So if there's glazing on a window, it doesn't include the cost to replace the window. It doesn't include the cost to put new tile down if you're taking out the mastic. And it doesn't include the cost to put new caulking or anything like that into a building.
Can we pause here just for a moment? One is the prior slide. Are the tasks here, the statewide survey, for instance, they're already in the budget and you already have a plan to go ahead and do this work? Is that on your to-do list already, or this is an idea that maybe it would be a good idea to do it?
The cost is on our to-do list, so we have not done any survey or inventory of the schools yet to date to determine how many fit within the built or renovated before 1980 category.
Okay, and so do you have a approximate timeline for when you would start this statewide survey and how long it would take to conduct it?
We're waiting for data from the Agency of Education on schools in the state so that we could actually reach out to those schools. I would estimate once we get that information, we could start doing outreach and receive data back within 6 months would be my guess, to have a very comprehensive understanding of what the population is.
Okay, great. And let me pause just to look around the rooms here and see if there are any other members of the two committees have questions. Senator Hooker.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. And I'm just curious to know on the buildings that you tested in Burlington High School, 3 of them seem to be, pretty close in the numbers, but building F is a real outlier. What was that building?
Building F is the building that has their tech center in it and their daycare.
Oh.
Building A has their gym, so they all have different building uses and different construction inside them. Some of them are all classrooms, some of them may be more industrial, but each one will find out, I think, more about what the main source of the contaminant issues are as we continue to sample.
Sure. Senator Lyons, then Senator Campion.
Thank you. Thank you for the slideshow and presentations. Very helpful. So I have a couple of questions, and first relating to EPA, but then moving down into the questions around our local high schools. So when was the last time that the EPA evaluated and made changes to the standards for PCBs? Do you know?
So I know at least for soil and building materials is 1980 timeframe when the TSCA regulations came out. I'm pretty sure Dr. Vos,
1976, right?
I know Dr. Bose will be able to talk to you about when they did the evaluation for the indoor air values, which is more recent. I don't know that part.
Okay. And then another question related, I mean, because obviously the understanding of the effect of lower levels has changed significantly since that time. The next question I have is with respect to enforcement, consumer products enforcement, Attorney General's office, and through the Attorney General's office, and was that active? I don't remember when that came into play. Was that active after 1980? This you don't if you don't know the answer, we can find out, but certainly there may be some leakage in the consumer products that came into the state if there wasn't any oversight for that. So I don't know.
I don't.
Okay. Then so that, and then the testing that's gone on obviously since 2013, have you done any testing at all on buildings that were constructed after 1980? And then as you're looking at Burlington High School, that seems like such a high level in that one building. It suggests to me that there might have been some additions, additive PCBs since 1980. And are you able to inquire about that and get at that issue?
Oh, sorry.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. So to be clear, within state Vermont government, there is no one that regulates PCBs and building materials. So we don't usually get involved in this process. The times that we are normally involved where there are PCBs and building materials is through our brownfields renovations for the most part, where we're seeing it and we're looking for it there, and they're cleaning it up. But at the same time, usually EPA will be involved, and so there's already a regulatory authority there. So there's not been a lot of reporting to the state on when PCBs are being found in schools. I am aware through recent digging that there has been some PCBs that are being found during renovations in schools, but indoor air is not being tested as part of that removal of usually caulking or window glazing. To the Burlington High School question, our understanding is that most of the school was built between 1965 and 1967. There may have been some renovations that happened afterwards, but I think the reason that they're in the process of trying to renovate the school now is because it hasn't been renovated in a very long time.
Okay,
Senator
but
Lyons,
so
you all set?
yeah, more or less. I mean, there's so many questions in this thing, and if we're going to start, we are very concerned. And as we start testing schools, regardless of when they were built, I think it's very important to understand if any of these products were distributed after the EPA ban on PCBs. I mean, because then if that is the case, how can we hold the schools harmless or the state harmless for the significant costs of testing and repair? So that's a comment, but I think it's a great concern. I do have one little tiny question, and that is, as you're doing testing, are you doing any on-site testing? Do you have that capacity to bring in your I don't know what you're using, a mass spectrometer or what?
For indoor air sampling, potentially. I know if you're doing the building material sampling, we had looked into that with use of the EPA mobile lab, and it doesn't work as well, only because what I understand anyway, when you're looking at a caulking, the PCBs are so entrenched within the material that you really need to make sure that you're grinding it up really well so that you can get the PCB concentrations out the best through extraction. So there's a potential that it could happen with indoor air, but probably not with the building materials.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And before going on to Senators Campion, Westman, and Hardy, just a quick follow-up then based on what Senator Lyons just asked. If those PCB containing materials may have been imported after the ban, does that 1980 date need to be moved closer in time?
We went back and forth on that because I'm sure there's the potential that there were, products of mastic or caulking that were ordered in bulk and now they're being used. So we could look later in like 1985 potentially and go back from there. So we did contemplate looking at a wider age range because of that thought process.
Okay, thanks. Senator Campion?
Thanks, Senator Bray. I'm wondering what it means to be non-detect. It seems as though non-detect, there's some PCB there, there's something. Is it just that's the safety level? I know we dealt with this a little bit when we were doing the lead bill as well.
So non-detect, you would basically look at what the detection limit is that the lab is reporting to you at, and let's say it's 4 nanograms per cubic meter. Non-detect would be below what their detection limit is.
But there's still PCB there.
Not that the instrument is reporting to you.
So non-detect means 0.
Non-detect means it's not being detected by the instrument.
Great, perfect, thank you.
Senator Westman?
I'm interested in, at the top level, it's 20,000 per school. And apparently you said that the ed agency is trying to refine the number of schools that would need to be tested that are before 1980. When will we have that information?
I'm not sure when the Agency of Education.
Tricia, if I might, for the record, Peter Watt, Commissioner of DC. Senator Westman, that's a great question. I think what we're finding across the board, and that's part of the reason why I believe that there's a broader effort to look into the condition of various school buildings around the state, is that we don't have great records at the state level, and we're working to improve those, but it is going to require a district by district survey to understand the full universe. This estimate was based on what we know and what we imagine is likely, but it will need to be significantly refined.
Well, I just say the 4.5 million is pretty much hitting between 15 and 20,000 per school because there's 250 schools in the state. It would seem that if we were going to move ahead with this, we should very quickly be able to find out with that confined number what the real number of schools would need to be done. I can pretty much tell you that of the 10 elementary schools in my district, 3 were built after 1980, and or 2 were built after 1980, and 1 has been completely the school gutted and rebuilt. So, but I would think we want to be pretty diligent to try to get those numbers to be able to move ahead with this.
Okay.
And to be fair, certainly we agree with that, and we want to get there. The question of timing and where we are in the legislative calendar, right? We wanted to get this in as part of the budget. We understand there was significant interest, and so wanted to make sure that process was started. And certainly there are other steps that we'll need to complete along the way.
I would say we put the money in for Burlington in the budget adjustment, but this is really pretty important stuff. And so a lot of us that have districts where we know our schools were built before. I haven't got a single high school in my district that was built after 1980. Having that information would be really important.
Okay. Commissioner Walk, I don't know if that is something on your to-do list or this goes back to Ms. Capolino, but who could we check in with to get a, basically something like a date certain to know what we're talking about so that we can then go ahead and do planning and budgeting?
So
Who kind of owns, who owns this that we can ask about it?
Right, so it's a combined effort between the Agency of Education, the Agency of Natural Resources, and the Department of Health. I think we all have a role to play here. I think one of the open questions, and frankly, you hit on it in your earlier questioning, was whether or not schools would be required to test. Because I think as Trish made clear, we currently don't regulate indoor air quality as a result of releases. It doesn't constitute a release under our current statute. So if we're we built this in part with the idea that it could be used as a volunteer testing program by schools or as a mandatory, but that question is frankly open and one we don't have control over, and one we would be looking to work with you on to understand what the desire of the General Assembly is.
Okay, thank you. So that seems like one to flag as a policy question to make sure we come back to. All right, Senator Hardy, thank you for waiting.
Thank you, Senator Bray. I have two clarifying questions and then a broader comment, but Patricia, could you just clarify for me, is the EPA level, is that the 15 nanograms per cubic meter, or is that the Vermont VDH level?
The Vermont VDH level is the 15 nanograms per cubic meter.
Okay, and then the EPA levels are those higher levels, the 100, 200, 300, whatever in that chart. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so that was my first clarifying. Second is there a requirement at this point in law or rule or wherever that requires entities, schools, or other public entities to report if they've detected any PCBs? Because I know this was an issue in Burlington that these were discovered and it took, I believe, almost a year for them to be reported to teachers and parents, et cetera. So is there a requirement or is it just voluntary?
So there's a requirement if PCBs are detected in groundwater, soil, sediment, or surface water in Vermont to be reported to the Agency of Natural Resources as a release. When PCBs are detected in building materials, the requirement for TSCA is to report it when they're ready to clean it up.
Aha. So that was probably contributed to the delay, that they weren't ready to clean it up yet, and it wasn't necessarily in the water and soil.
It was in the soil, and it was in the soil from the building materials contaminating the soil. So that should have been reported to the Agency of Natural Resources at that time as a release.
Okay, I see. And just sort of broader, and Commissioner Walk kind of alluded to this, but this feels a little bit like deja vu. I was on the Senate Education Committee 2 years ago when we went through this whole process with the lead water testing that Senator Campion mentioned. And it seems to me that we're going to every 2 years have some other issue or other toxic chemical that's found in schools or somewhere. And I'm wondering if it may be prudent, or not wondering, I think it would be prudent to sort of set up this kind of system more broadly. If you're doing a survey already or planning one, maybe we should include other things in that survey. I think the sort of system that was created by Department of Health and DEC for the lead testing, as far as I know, worked quite well. And I was very impressed with the public database that you set up and everything. So I'm just wondering if there are other things on our radar. I know radon is one issue, and there are other toxic chemicals that may be helpful to include in this. But doing so without losing sight of the urgency of the PCBs, but it may be more efficient to tackle it. And I'm wondering if maybe Commissioner, if you were going to address something like that in your comments, or if you have any thoughts about that.
Trish, I'm happy to weigh in. I think you have identified a key issue. I will say that I don't believe that, it's easy to see the sort of the lead and PCB issues as similar, and there are lots of similarities, right? Things we don't want to be in schools as a basic starting point. The challenge is that what we would do when we found a lead in drinking water in schools was primarily a sort of replacement of the faucet or drinking water fountain or whatever it might be, which was relatively small scale and inexpensive. This really would require sort of building wide survey of materials, significant investigation. The cleanup is significantly more expensive. And so it's a little bit different to have them on the same sort of timelines and thought processes. And they're as we think about what other things we might be looking for, that sort of raises further challenges as to sort of would the identification of an issue and the potential remediation of that issue be on similar timelines, and how we would resolve some of those things. But I do appreciate, and that's one of the things certainly that that the Agency of Education is thinking about in terms of their survey, is to understand sort of the full gamut of need. And so there is, but that is on a more deliberate and diligent timeline, as Senator Westman referred to, in trying to understand that sort of full context. But understanding the full context does make it move slower.
Okay, I just don't want to waste a good survey. If you're going to survey schools, they get a lot of surveys. You might as well survey them about multiple things at the same time.
Right.
Have data.
Let me clarify quickly, just so there's not confusion. So the survey we would do would be a quick sort of tell us about the age of your building, so we understand the universe of the testing need. The survey that AOE has in place is contemplating, and I believe is part of the budget discussion. I'm a little unclear about that, but we can get the details for you. Would be more of a hiring somebody to do a more detailed analysis of the state of Vermont school buildings across the board. And so that's a much different level of effort than would be required for us to kind of do that first screening level examination of what buildings might need to be tested.
Right. Well, and to Senator Hardy's point, and I'm sure Senator Lyons, whose hand is up, will have something more she can share with us too. I mean, on our agenda, this is listed as PCBs and other chemicals of concern, because we know that we don't want to be in the whack-a-mole business of coming back one by one by one. And that's always seems like it's one of our challenges with toxins, that over time we identify more of them, or we become more sensitive to the impacts of things that we once thought were healthy, now we see as maybe riskier than we believe because science advances. So it seems like another follow-on discussion would be, how do we have a more comprehensive survey plan, regardless of the timeline for the different chemicals, because they're not all the same, and the fixes aren't all the same. I would hate to have anyone listen to us talking about this and come away, and I know you don't mean this, that we don't want to look for things that would be very expensive to remediate. So we'll have to figure out a way around, how to address that. Senator Lyons, and then Senator Westman, and then Senator Campion.
Oh, thank you. As the discussion goes on, of course, it reminds us that the Vermont Department of Health, and through our Health and Welfare Committee, we've put in place a comprehensive children's products assessment of toxic chemicals and trying to eliminate those toxic chemicals from children's products. The original intent of that program was to have a full expanse of consumer products generally. And that hasn't happened, but it is absolutely essential, I think, as Senator Bray has said, that we have that comprehensive analysis or actually elimination of those chemicals that are so toxic, particularly to public health. So that's a broader conversation. Right now, we're nickel and diming schools. and then we're making a decision that maybe we shouldn't be testing some chemicals in schools because it's so expensive. And we should. I mean, there's no question that we should be working as quickly as possible to change over the school environment for kids. So it will be costly, but I do think that this all falls into the purview, in this case, as did lead, it falls into the purview of the Department of Health, and we need to work on that. I know that ANR also has the hazardous chemicals group that's looking at hazardous chemicals. I'm very concerned that we let some of the schools go for one reason or another. We need to have that list, and we need to know what contamination is there, regardless of cost, because the cost to our children and to healthcare in the future is astronomical. Just looking at PCBs, looking at BPA, and related compounds, the cost in Maine was over $637 million a year for healthcare effects for kids. So you hear my plea. I think working together to test, get the information, Senator Hardy's interest in transparency for the public is also critical. But I think first we have to know what's there.
So Sarah Lyons, if I might just clarify, I don't want to leave the impression with the committee at all that we are not looking to test. We wouldn't have put forward this proposal if we weren't looking to test.
I did not, Commissioner, I did not get that impression. And you've always been very proactive in this area. So thank you.
Appreciate that.
Right. Yeah. And same here. I'm just saying there will be some people who will be concerned about the liability of what could be revealed by testing. And I think, my sense of this room is that everyone wants to go ahead with the testing, regardless of what kind of financial implications that testing might reveal to all of us. Senator Westman?
I just like to say, I totally agree that we should do something comprehensive. This problem is in front of us. Many of us have lots of schools that were built before 1980, and the legislature more than likely will be on more of a normal schedule this year than we've been. So we have we'll be gone after May. And so from my vantage point, there's some urgency to figure out what schools might be at risk where we are, to be able to make sure we can deal with that, because I wouldn't want to be in the position of waiting for another year.
Sure. Well, thank you for that. Ms. Capolino, you just took down your PowerPoint, and I was going to ask you about your second budgeting page.
Mr. Senator Brake, may I just get in the queue,
yes.
also, please?
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you.
This might be for the commissioner. Do we know, for example, I know with your work with PFOA, we've had these conversations over the years where, we can outlaw certain things in the United States and in the state of Vermont, but then they still might come in, from other countries. And I'm just wondering, do we know, and this might be a kind of a silly question, but are people manufacturing in other countries with PCBs? And is it possible that we are, receiving in this country things with PCBs that, as we continue to build, et cetera? Do we have any sense of that?
That is not a question I can answer at this point. But yeah, I agree with you that there are challenges to the way we regulate chemicals at the federal level under TSCA. Some of the changes that were part of the Lautenberg amendments in 2016 helped improve that system, but it is yeah, there are challenges. So let us dig into that a little bit more, unless Trish has some knowledge off the top of her head. But that's, we'll have to.
No, I really appreciate that. And I'm wondering also, and this could be kind of, I mean, are PCBs, just so I know, are they being used anywhere now in the United States, or is it just they're done? I mean, there's no, they're not in. If I buy, you know, when I go out later to buy a beam for something, which I usually do on a Tuesday afternoon, it's definitely, there's nothing, there's no reason to be concerned that a PCB might have been manufactured and put into something in this country.
So there's still PCBs that are used in capacitors and transformers and other industrial products that are not required to remove the PCBs right now. So EPA is still allowing for that use. So there are still,
if a school were to buy something, and would they know that it has a PCBs in it, you know, going forward?
So in the US, they're banned. I'm
Okay.
not aware that they're being manufactured in other parts of the world right now. I haven't seen that. I did look for that earlier. Maybe even Dr. Vos might know more, but I'm not seeing that they're still being manufactured.
Okay.
Senator Lyons?
No, that's what I was going to say. I'm good.
Okay. So before we go on, or can I just confirm that the $4.5 million ballpark estimate for testing for PCB statewide, is that in the current governor's recommend?
Yes.
Okay.
It's
And
part of the one-time surplus spending recommendations. It is
okay.
Included in it as part of a $10 million transfer to the environmental contingency fund, and up to $5 million of that is set aside for testing and technical support and the public awareness website for work that Senator Hardy referenced.
Okay. And Ms. Capolino's second budgetary slide with all the remediation, et cetera, that's where we don't have monies allocated yet, because those are going to be on a case-by-case basis.
Correct.
Mr. Chair?
Yes. I just wanted to get that part straight, and then Senator McDonald.
Just
okay, Senator
McDonald. We hear occasionally the phrase one-time spending, surplus money, but et cetera. What exactly does that mean?
Is that a question for me, or?
No, that was Mr. Walk used that, and it's we in budgetary matters we hear more frequently the expression one-time money, surplus something or other. That's where the money is coming from. What is could we get a more specific understanding of what that term means?
Sorry, my internet connectivity got a little unstable there. As I was trying to explain it, I think I cut out. It is essentially a transfer from the general fund to the environmental contingency fund that is not part of our base budget, is not an ongoing expense. It is a transfer, a one-time transfer recommended in the budget that would transfer general fund dollars into the environmental contingency fund. And then from there, $5 million, up to $5 million would be made available for this testing proposal.
So when the general fund is when the budget is being crafted for state spending, it will be short that amount of money this year. And is there where is it going to come from? Just from the routine revenues to the general fund?
Correct. And in the belief from both the legislative and the executive economists that there was an increase in revenue in this, or it's projected for the coming year, that we're not likely to see on an ongoing basis. It comes from that portion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. The Finance Committee will probably be looking at the kind of roller coaster projections about revenues that have been taking place over the last 9 months where they're up and they're down and they're up and they're down. So thank you very much, and thanks for the clarification.
Can I quickly ask Senator McCormick a question? That has this been taken up in the institutions committee at all as a capital expenditure? You're muted, Senator. No.
Up or no?
Good reason to learn sign language.
Yeah.
It's an up or no question. It's a yes or no question there. Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Has it been taken up in institutions as possible capital expenditure for any of the remediation? Oh, okay. That might be a good conversation.
Well, part of the interesting thing about this meeting is that we have our committee is usually focusing on what's outside of a building. Our territory sort of tends to come up to the building's edge, and then health and welfare, I don't know how you would describe it. It's more like you're looking at products and things people have in their hands, and I don't know who sort of owns the indoor space of a school. Maybe that's education, worrying about what's going on inside there, but it's of interest to all of us. And so it's good that we're all in the same meeting at the same time, because we don't want it to fall through the cracks just by virtue of not quite being clearly someone's jurisdiction.
I will say, Senator, that anything that affects the human condition in terms of the indoor environment is clearly health and welfare. But however, in this instance, it certainly is a part of the educational enterprise for expenditures and remediation, and it carries outside to the soil, as you heard, soil testing. So it affects each one of our committees.
Right. We say if it's on planet Earth, our committee's interested.
That's good. We like that.
Okay. So Ms. Vose and Mr. Englander, you've been with us. Well, let me pause and say, Ms. Capolino, did you have anything more you wanted to share with us this morning? I know you've already, thank you very much for that helpful, orderly presentation on the whole issue.
I don't have anything else right now.
Okay. And so I don't know if Ms. Vose or Mr. Englander, if you had anything you wanted that you had planned to share with us on this topic, or you were just here for technical support,
Yeah, so my name's Sarah Vose. I'm the state toxicologist, and I assess the health risk from exposure to chemicals in our environment. So Trish did include an explanation of health effects from PCBs, so I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about that.
Well, I do have one quick one, and that is, as part of our work on plastics last summer, summer before last, we learned about PCBs as, we're getting a sign held up here. I am unmuting, it is not responding. Okay, we're not holding you responsible for an equipment failure. Thank you, Senator McCormick. At any rate, we were looking at that moment at PFAS, and then we had testimony from I'm forgetting his name, a PhD from down at Johns Hopkins, who was talking to us about PFAS and other plastics as endocrine disruptors. And then it was orders of magnitude, like 2 orders of magnitude more sensitive in terms of possible impacts. So can you just say a little bit about, we might feel like our 15 nanograms per cubic meter is a reasonable standard, but do you have the sense that we will learn that these are actually impactful at even lower concentrations and that we'll need to adjust them in the future? I mean, where is this the levels will keep dropping as our understanding becomes more and more subtle?
Yeah, So PCBs, and I think Trish might have mentioned this, PCBs are a class of 209 different chemicals that we call PCBs. And some of them are very potent endocrine disruptors. We also know that they are potent developmental toxicants, so they affect the way that a developing baby's brain is formed, and those can have impacts to children later in life. And we know that these PCBs last a very long time in the environment, so that's similar to PFAS. They don't break down very easily. They also don't leave our bodies very quickly, so the half-lives of PCBs, they do range because there are 209, but some of them are decades. So we do have a lot of concern about those when you're dealing with developmental toxicants, especially something that can stay in your body for a very long time. It means that even short exposures to, for example, young women could lead to exposure to their baby later on in life. As far as the levels, Trish explained a little bit about detection level and reporting level. The screening value that we created was selected to be above the detection level because, it's not very feasible to have a screening level that's below what the machines can detect. So your question of whether or not it would go lower, I think would be a function of how quickly the analytical methods, so one, if they change and how quickly they change to be able to go down orders of magnitude. But I mean, nanograms per meter cubed is already a very low, we're in the very low range there.
Right. Okay, thank you. Senator Lyons?
So thank you, Dr. Voss. The question I have is, do we have any indication of, is there a trend line in a state or any indication of increased effects or effects as a result of PCB exposure in kids? Obviously developmental delays or autism or some of the effects may be there, but have we done any measurement, public health measurement on those illnesses or changes that would suggest PCBs have had an effect?
There are publications that look at neurodevelopmental impacts from PCBs. There are not any.
I guess I'm talking about Vermont more. I'm not talking about sort of the general literature, but yeah.
So I was just going to say there are not any that specifically look at exposure in schools for some of the reasons that Trish has explained, and there are not any that look at exposure outcomes in Vermont.
Okay. Any other questions for our guests from the Department of Health this morning? All right. Well, thanks. Since I haven't seen you in a meeting since the last session, I'll just say this is one of those on behalf of every Vermonter. Thank you so much for all your work during the pandemic. I know it's something we say, and it sounds like it gets repeated. It's hard for us to appreciate how much work it's been for you all, but we appreciate it and know that part of the reason that Vermont is doing so exceptionally well in the country is because of the work of you and your colleagues. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. I'll pass it along. I work with a very broad group of people, but I'll pass it along to everyone. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. All right. So that finishes a first conversation as a group on PCBs and school testing. Thankfully, there's money in the budget, at least to address this particular toxin. But the bigger question that I think we'll want to work on as a group is how do we move away from being reactive to the discovery of one thing to getting out ahead of a wider panel of tests. And I think, so we've done a version of it with lead, we've done a version of it with PFAS, now we're talking about revisiting on PCBs. Radon, when I was on the education committee, had come up as another problem. And so I'm just sensing that it's a little bit like Groundhog Day, where we're having another version of the same conversation repeatedly. I don't know what plans I guess we should continue the conversation about how do we move from reactive to looking at things that aren't already listed as a known problem, but may well be there. Senator Lyons.
So thank you for the comments. I couldn't agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more, in particular with respect to the good work that the Department of Health is doing during this difficult time. The reason I raised my hand is that Senate Health and Welfare needs to move back into its own room at this point. And thank you for the joint meeting.
We didn't want to say anything, but it was getting a little crowded in here.
Yeah, I can tell, we want a good air quality.
All right.
Maybe,
thanks for joining us.
I have a question for Commissioner Walk and for Dr. Voss. And that is, have we tested the State House for this? A bad question.
I am not aware of any tests at the State House.
Okay.
For PCBs. Obviously, we are talking about a subset of buildings at this point, but obviously that wasn't limited to the use of PCB containing building materials in schools.
Okay. Thank you. And committee, as soon as Senator Hooker finishes
before you go,
her
Senator
comment or
Hooker asked
question,
something.
we need to leave.
Yeah, just a quick question to Dr. Voss. Are there any anticipated studies for looking into the prevalence of effects of the PCBs?
So maybe I can just explain quickly. So EPA's levels are based on the state of the science as of 1994. And when we looked at the same science, we also looked at newer science. 1994 was quite a while ago. And that's one of the reasons why our levels are so much lower. So whether or not EPA will go back and take another look at the additional decades of research that show health effects, including developmental neurotoxicity at lower doses than what they found in 1994, I think it's anybody's guess as to if and when they would ever reopen that and come up with a lower level.
But with regard to what's happened at Burlington High School, will Vermont move forward and look at the effects that PCBs have had? We've said that there's no data, and I'm just questioning, how do we go forward when we have no data to rely on as far as what the effects have been?
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. So I think you're asking if we would do an epidemiology study, and typically when we're asked that question, those studies are typically done in academic institutions that are research entities, and we're not a research entity. Typically the number of people you would need to enroll and the amount of time you would have to conduct the study would be very prohibitive. In Vermont, we have such a low population, but there are a number of studies, and granted they weren't done specifically in Vermont, but there are those epidemiology studies done on larger populations that do show these outcomes pretty consistently and clearly in different populations.
Thank you. Sorry to hold up our committee.
All right, well, good to see the members of Health and Welfare. Thanks for joining us. See you again. And thank you, Department of Health.
Okay, thank you.
With that committee, we're turning to hearing from Commissioner Walk about a so-called, maintenance bill, collection of items that agency would like to have us consider moving forward this session. And Commissioner Walk, I apologize. We ran longer than anticipated on the health discussion. We have about 20 minutes or so. Is that enough time, or would you like to reschedule?
I think it's enough time to get started. What I
Okay.
have for you is a set of PowerPoint slides. I think that provide an overview as to the challenges we're trying to solve with the actual legislative language. And I think we can go through that, and then we can see where questions lie, and then come back with the actual language where it'll will kind of tack and tie and make more sense. If that makes sense.
Great. So we'll get a survey and then dig in later.
And we're joined by Greg Boble from the Natural Resources Board, who part of our corrections has a piece for the NRB in it as well. We figured it was easier to do it all in one bill.
Great. Good morning, Mr. Boble.
Good morning.
So Jude, okay, Jude, you have given me authority to share. Thank you. Let me do that. Let me know when you all can see my screen.
All set.
Okay. So good morning again. For the record, my name is Peter Walk. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. We have a number of proposed related, we call them sort of technical corrections, things that have come up over time that we think should be addressed to better serve Vermont and Vermonters as we implement the statutes in front of us. So let me go back quickly. There's a number of pieces, various things from the brownfield program to the salvage yard program, talking about beverage container commingling, changes to the way we report to you on the clean water investment activity, several changes we recommend to Act 150 and related public notice around permits, and some modest change to the drinking water revolving fund, as I mentioned, the NRB piece, and then some clarifying pieces around the fees that we collect that we think will help improve the overall understanding of what's required. So with that, I'll jump in.
Okay.
So the first change relates to the brownfield program. Currently, the RDCs, the Regional Development Corps, and RPCs, the Regional Planning Commissions, can acquire a brownfield, enter an agreement with ANR. Municipalities can't do this currently, and we think that that's an opportunity for a change. I think the other piece that we're looking at is oftentimes when we're taking on a brownfield site with a prospective owner, the liability protection doesn't come into place until after some of the activities will have taken place, and we think it's prudent to provide some of that protection once the sort of examination begins for prospective purchasers, so that they can be more inclined to undertake some of the activities that will lead to eventual cleanups. So that's a small change, but one we think will have pretty meaningful impact.
And can you remind the committee what BRELA stands for, please?
Oh boy.
Is this like
No,
brownfields?
no, I cannot. It's the but I will send you what that acronym means.
Okay,
Yes, it's
no worries.
Yep, apologize. We use acronyms a lot and we tend to forget what they mean over time. So the Salvage Art program currently requires annual training for permitted salvage yards. What we've come to discover over time is that the regulations don't change enough, and they're not the changes aren't ongoing enough to really require annual training. At this point, we would propose to eliminate that training requirement, as we don't find it to be necessary to the safe operation of salvage yards. in the work, all of the work that we've done around clean water, there have been a number of changes to what information we provide to you and how we provide it. That has led to a fair amount of duplication within the statute about sort of timelines and information. And we do our best to, in the Clean Water Investment Report, kind of tie all those various threads together. Now that we have a few years under our belt of that report providing good information to this committee and other committees that are interested in the process, we think it's an opportunity to adjust some of the reporting requirements to better to better reflect the information that you need and the sort of where we are in the process of cleanup. And happy to go through some of those specifics and bring folks in to answer your questions about what those changes mean. But this will make our report drafting easier and not provide not change the information that you're getting, essentially. One of the issues that came up, and Senator Bray, I believe you're familiar with this in your time in LCAR, and others maybe too, came up with the underground storage tank rule, essentially where we have a change of ownership of on a permit where Act 150 currently requires us to go out for notice, essentially for just changing the name on a permit without changing any of the conditions, without changing anything else. That comes into play when a gas station changes hands or a business that has an underground storage tank changes hands, and it requires them to stop operating for 14 days just based on an ownership change. We have never received a comment on one of those permits, and so we would propose to change the definition of an administrative amendment to include transfers of ownership, only if it's authorized by rule, as it would be under the underground storage tank rule. But that's a way to address the concern that LCAR had and trying to make sure that there's clarity on that there is no value being added to that notice occurring, or not significant value and not enough to change the nature of the permit, certainly. And then this is we've been having a lot of discussions about dam mortars as things have evolved in the past few years, and there's a desire to move certain dam mortars from type 3 notification requirements to type 2. Happy to provide more detail and remind everybody what the difference in the various types are at some point, but just sort of flagging this as a piece, just helping for notification of adjoining landowners is the primary concern.
Thank you.
And then we have a bit there. The next two are kind of a bit of a sort of, as we have lived with Act 150, we've noticed some things that don't quite line up. In this instance, for a wetland determination, so if we determine a wetland to be a Class 2 wetland, it's required to go on 30 days of public notice. At the same time, we can allow activity under a notice of intent with 14-day notice, so that they tend to happen in parallel, and so that until it's formally recognized as being a regulated wetland requiring a permit, we could authorize the activity. And so we think aligning those two makes sense because they are essentially the same, part and parcel with the same activity. And so would recommend changing the wetland determination from a type 2 to a type 4. Happy to discuss that further. Interesting thing happened as as Act 150 has evolved, the permit, the current statute that affects lake encroachment permits requires that the permit doesn't go into effect until 10 days after the department's decision. It creates interesting inconsistency and variability in a way that's difficult to enforce with other permits. And so we think it should be aligned with all of the other permits that we issue whereby it is effective as soon as the permit is issued.
It seemed like it could cause a rush of things you wouldn't desire to happen.
It certainly, we want, there's a reason why we require permit coverage. There's a reason why people apply for permits, and as soon as the permit is issued, you should be able to proceed. And obviously, yeah, it does create potential timeline ramifications. It is an bit of an enforcement challenge. So currently, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund requires a 3% interest rate and a maximum loan term of 20 years related to land acquisition for public water source protection. In contrast, for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, we have much more flexibility in terms of what we are able to offer in terms of loan conditions and rates based on where the market is, and gives us flexibility to help get money out the door to communities that need it. That is not the case as it's statutorily set here for the Drinking Water Revolving Fund, and we think it's an opportunity to address that so we can use more of our tools to get more money out the door to Vermont municipalities who need it.
It does seem a bit odd to specify the interest rate in statute.
I would agree with you. And so, Mr. Mobile, you are away.
Okay, thank you to the committee for having us here today. Thank you, Commissioner Walk, for inviting us to present with you. The recommended changes to Act 250, I think, are relatively benign, and they're all a result, more or less, of a new fully online application and new database that we are in the process of constructing. We're hopeful that the new application and database will be rolled out in the next 3 months or so. And as we've been developing these applications, we've realized that there are a few statutory changes that we need to make in order for our future process under the new database and application to be consistent with so the first of these 3 recommended changes is to shift obligation from the applicant to the district commission for providing notice to statutory parties. We've realized in creating the new application online form, that there's just going to be some technological problems in having the applicant file the notice with statutory parties. So we thought the easy solution is for the district commission to do it as applications come in. We've also realized that the new database can only count days using calendar days as opposed to business days. So we recommend changing any day that is currently counted now as a business day to a calendar day. And that simply means going through the statute and adding a certain number of days to each day that's currently counted as a business day in order to compensate for the difference between calendar days and business days. And then finally, there is a provision 6083A in statute that defines what an application for Act 250 permits must contain. It's quite specific, and we think that it would make more sense to simply define what an application should contain by way of rule and or by way of guidance, since these things do change from time to time. The current provisions require, for instance, 4 paper copies of an application to be filed, which is no longer relevant. So the idea would be simply to strike those provisions and instead defer to rules and guidance for the specifics of what an application should contain. And that sums up our 3 proposed changes. Thanks again.
Great. Very quick question on number 1 there. Who has the burden of identifying the parties that need to be notified?
So the statutory parties don't ever change. It's the municipality, the landowner, if the landowner is not the applicant, adjoining municipalities, the Agency of Natural Resources, and so forth. So those don't ever change. And that's why it's easy enough for us to simply send out the notice once we receive a notice of an application. The applicant is required to identify property owners and others who may have an interest in the application. And that's a provision in the statute that we're not proposing to change. The applicant still has to file a list of adjoining applicants, a list of adjoining neighbors, and also others with potential with a potential interest with the district commission, whom will be noticed the application is complete and there is a hearing set.
Great. All right. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Mr. Chair, the BRELA stands for Brownfield Reuse and Environmental Liability Limitation Act.
Oh, thank you. I think I heard that once, like 5 years ago. So
there's a good reason why we call it BRELA. All right. So a couple of minor changes to the way fees are calculated and what constitutes different things that are frankly just sort of clarifying. Right
always
now,
good to end on a high note.
well, and on septage. So right now the statute reads it's $10 per 1,000 gallons based on the rated capacity of the tank being pumped rounded to the nearest 1,000 gallon. I don't know, I would have difficult calculating that. What we are proposing is simply to change it to what that effectively means is 1 cent per gallon of septage, and to clarify that portable toilets are required to pay the fee, and so that's really the sort of nature of it. It is just trying to provide a little bit easier way of understanding what the fee looks like, so that those who are required to pay will know what to pay.
Okay. And that was your last item, right?
One more.
Oh, one more, sorry.
So for solid waste haulers, there's some conflict, and then there are some sort of references to work that a waste hauler might, or a property manager might do relative to things. And so this one's easier to look at it in the statute itself. And then there is, just some clarification. And so it's really looking to provide some clarity around those pieces, and we can walk through the actual language. I think it'll make more sense when you see it. But that's, sort of proposed changes there in the solid waste hauler fee. Okay. So it doesn't this one doesn't actually affect the fee. It affects some of the language that describes who's obligated to pay the fee.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for the sort of the 10,000 foot view and a timely survey. Has the agency done drafting on most of these already?
We have, and if I could figure out how to stop sharing, I would come out of it. So I shared that with Jude when I sent the PowerPoint slide in, so you've got that. Okay. And we're happy to walk through it when you have more time, understanding that. So we certainly appreciate you being willing to consider it. We haven't had a technical corrections bill in several years, and so there's a number of things that have sort of built up that we'd like to address.
Okay, well, great. Well, so lots more to discuss, but thank you for introducing the topic, and we'll follow up to talk about going through it and scheduling and things like that. It's a little hard for me to judge what the time required will be for us to learn at whatever level we need to learn at to move a bill, but thank you for bringing it. And sorry that I seem to be going a little fast. Usually we don't have caucus till 12:15, but today we're actually having a caucus in 5 minutes now. If you look in your email, you will find an email from Vanessa with the link. We'll be having a caucus of the whole on the Budget Adjustment Act at 12. So with that, unless anyone has something they'd like to chip in before we wrap for the day, I don't see anything. Okay, so thank you, Mr. Vogel. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, committee. We are adjourned for today, and see you